Most people believe they live in a world of objects and events, of solid causes followed by visible effects, and they arrange their efforts accordingly, pushing upon matter as if matter were primary. This belief is convenient to the senses but inaccurate to the structure of nature. What appears fixed is only slowed movement, and what appears permanent is only energy maintaining a temporary pattern. Before form there is vibration, before action there is oscillation, and before any result there is a state. The universe does not respond to desire, nor to effort, nor to intention expressed in words, but to frequency established as fact. When this is not understood, a person exhausts himself attempting to correct surfaces while the source remains untouched, and life appears resistant when it is only precise. Energy does not negotiate, and it does not reason. It obeys law. Matter is not the cause of events, but the record of prior conditions, condensed and delayed until they appear tangible. When a man moves his hand, it seems he causes motion, yet the motion is only the final echo of electrical impulses already completed within his nervous system. The same principle governs all outcomes. What you experience is the last link in a chain that began long before awareness intervened. To change effects while leaving causes intact is to argue with a shadow. The universe answers the dominant vibration, not the spoken request, and it does so without judgment or preference, as any machine responds to input. This misunderstanding is the root of repeated failure. A man wants wealth and pushes harder at his labor, unaware that labor is only a secondary expression of an internal state. Another seeks harmony and rearranges his environment, not realizing that disorder was generated before it was observed. They treat manifestation as an act, when in truth it is a condition. Action modifies form, but frequency determines what forms are available to action. Until the internal condition changes, effort circles upon itself. This is why struggle produces little, and why ease often follows alignment without force. The universe is exacting, but it is not cruel. It responds faithfully to what is stable, not to what is pleaded. There is nothing mystical in this, only scale and timing. A radio does not receive a station because it wants music, but because its internal circuits are tuned to the correct band. No amount of desire can replace calibration. The same applies to human experience. Your life is the audible output of an internal setting, maintained moment by moment. When the setting is inconsistent, the signal fragments. When it is coherent, reality reorganizes with quiet efficiency. The mistake is believing that form persuades frequency, when the opposite is always true. Frequency arranges form, and form merely reveals what has already been decided at a level most never examine. Energy precedes matter as thought precedes motion. Yet thought itself is rarely understood. People imagine thought as a private fantasy, but it is not isolated. It is a measurable pattern of electrical activity, reinforced or weakened through repetition. When repeated, it becomes a standing wave. When stabilized, it becomes a condition. The world you inhabit reflects these conditions with delay, but without error. What appears sudden is only the moment when accumulation becomes visible. The universe has been responding all along. The listener who understands this begins to recognize that nothing is accidental, and nothing arrives without a prior invitation encoded in frequency. If you wish to understand manifestation, you must abandon the notion of coercion. You cannot compel reality any more than you can force a pendulum to obey a rhythm it is not tuned to follow. You can only set conditions and allow law to complete its function. When a condition is weak, the response is unstable. When it is firm, the response is inevitable. This is not optimism. It is mechanics. A bridge collapses not because of belief, but because resonance was ignored. A life unfolds not because of hope, but because a dominant vibration was maintained long enough to shape probability itself. The physical world is therefore not a battleground but a display, a screen upon which invisible arrangements become visible in sequence. Those who understand this cease to argue with appearances. They observe them as data. They do not panic at delay, nor do they become intoxicated by early success. They know that frequency, once established, must express itself. just as stored energy must discharge when conditions permit. The illusion of chance dissolves, replaced by recognition of order operating beyond impatience. In this recognition, effort becomes minimal and precision becomes essential. When you attempt to manifest through force, you announce incoherence. When you attempt through desire alone, you announce instability. The universe listens only for consistency. It responds to what is, not to what is wished. The first discipline, therefore, is not action, but observation of your own state. Until you accept that reality is frequency, before it is form, you will continue to work at the wrong level. Once you accept it, nothing feels urgent, yet everything begins to move. This calm is not passivity, it is alignment with the level at which causes actually operate. Reality responds to stable frequency, not to desire or force. Once reality is understood as a response to frequency rather than to effort, the role of thought must be re-examined. Thought is not a hope released into silence, nor a private monologue without consequence. It is a transmission. Every sustained thought generates a pattern of electrical activity, and every pattern, when repeated, becomes a signal. The universe does not distinguish between what is spoken inwardly and what is acted outwardly. It registers only consistency. A thought held once is noise. A thought held repeatedly becomes instruction. Most people believe thinking is passive because its effects are delayed. Yet delay does not negate causation, it merely obscures it. A broadcast is defined not by intention, but by clarity. A transmitter that fluctuates cannot be received, no matter how powerful its output. In the same way, a mind that alternates between belief and doubt emits interference rather than command. Wanting something intensely while fearing its absence produces a scrambled signal. The desire amplifies, the doubt cancels, and the result is incoherence. This is why longing often coincides with delay. The universe receives the dominant pattern, not the emotional intensity. Thought must therefore be examined not for its content alone, but for its stability across time. Most people think continuously, yet they do not think coherently. Their mental activity shifts with mood, circumstance, and external influence. One moment affirms, the next negates. 1 hour anticipates, the next resents. Each reversal resets the signal. The universe responds faithfully to this instability by producing inconsistent results. This is not punishment, it is accuracy. A system that cannot maintain a frequency cannot lock onto an outcome. Repetition without consistency is not reinforcement, it is cancellation. What you repeatedly contradict, you cannot receive. Thought becomes effective only when it is sustained beyond emotion. Emotion is a carrier, not a commander. It can strengthen a signal when aligned, but it can also distort it when uncontrolled. Excitement followed by anxiety creates oscillation rather than direction. Calm conviction produces coherence. This is why those who manifest with ease appear emotionally neutral about outcomes. Their thoughts are not charged by urgency, but stabilized by certainty. The universe responds more readily to calm coherence than to desperate intensity, because calm coherence is readable. A thought held briefly leaves no imprint. A thought held habitually alters internal structure. Neural pathways form, expectations adjust, perception reorganizes. Opportunities appear not because the world changed, but because the receiver became capable of detecting them. This is often mistaken for coincidence. In truth, perception is the first visible shift after frequency alignment. When thought becomes consistent, reality begins to present corresponding options. Behavior follows perception, and outcome follows behavior. Yet all originate in the broadcast maintained internally. It is therefore incorrect to say that thought creates reality directly. Thought establishes conditions under which certain realities become accessible. A man who repeatedly thinks in terms of limitation does not summon misfortune. He restricts his perceptual range until only limited paths remain visible. Another who maintains a thought of capability does not command success. He remains receptive to signals that guide action efficiently. The universe is not persuaded, it is matched. Thought does not bend law, it aligns with it. Mental repetition must be deliberate. Unexamined thinking produces unexamined results. When a thought is chosen consciously and revisited without contradiction, it begins to function as a stable carrier wave. Other mental noise becomes irrelevant. External opinions lose influence. Time ceases to feel adversarial. The signal strengthens not through volume but through persistence. This persistence is not strain, it is continuity. The universe responds to what continues, not to what erupts. Those who fail at manifestation often accuse thought of weakness, yet the weakness lies not in thinking, but in inconsistency. They speak one language in private and another in action. They imagine one outcome and prepare for another. Each division introduces interference. A clear signal requires internal agreement. Until thought, expectation, and assumption converge, the broadcast remains fragmented. The universe responds correctly by withholding resolution, waiting for clarity to emerge. To master manifestation, thought must be treated as engineering, not as wishing. It must be selected, stabilized, and maintained without contradiction. When this occurs, reality reorganizes gradually, but inevitably. The broadcast is received. The mechanism is engaged. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. There is only a quiet sense of inevitability replacing effort. The listener who understands this recognizes why wanting was never enough, and why consistency is the true lever of change. Thought becomes reality only when it is repeated without contradiction. Once thought is understood as a transmission, the next obstacle becomes unavoidable to confront: resistance within the system itself. A signal may be clear, yet fail to produce result, because opposing frequencies exist simultaneously. Most people do not fail because they lack desire or even discipline, but because their internal state is divided. One part of the mind projects an intention, while another quietly contradicts it. The universe does not average these conditions. It responds to the net frequency. When internal signals oppose each other, they neutralize force, and manifestation collapses into delay. This division is rarely conscious. A person may state a goal with confidence, yet beneath the statement exists an expectation of failure shaped by memory, habit, or identity. These underlying patterns operate continuously, while conscious intention is applied intermittently. The stronger signal is therefore not the spoken desire, but the unexamined assumption beneath it. Energy follows dominance, not declaration. What you secretly expect carries more weight than what you publicly affirm. Until this hierarchy is reversed, repetition produces little change. Doubt is not merely hesitation, it is an active counter-frequency. When doubt arises, it introduces oscillation into the signal, creating instability that prevents lock-in. Even mild uncertainty, if persistent, erodes coherence. The universe reads this fluctuation precisely and withholds resolution, not as refusal, but because the instruction is incomplete. A machine receiving contradictory commands does not malfunction, it waits. In the same way, reality pauses when internal agreement is absent. Emotional noise compounds this effect. Fear, impatience, and anticipation all distort transmission when allowed to dominate. These emotions do not negate desire, but they fragment it. A calm mind emits a narrow, precise frequency. An agitated mind emits a broad, chaotic spectrum. Precision produces results. Noise produces motion without direction. This is why intense emotional effort often coincides with exhaustion rather than outcome. Energy is expended correcting internal conflict rather than shaping external conditions. The subconscious is not an adversary. It is a storage system for repeated impressions. Whatever has been rehearsed most often resides there as default instruction. When a new intention conflicts with this stored pattern, resistance appears. The mind resists not because the desire is wrong, but because continuity has been broken. The subconscious prefers consistency to improvement. It maintains what is familiar until repetition proves otherwise. Manifestation therefore fails not because the universe refuses, but because the internal archive has not been rewritten. Internal coherence is achieved not by force, but by alignment. When conscious thought, emotional expectation, and habitual belief converge, resistance dissolves. The system stops wasting energy compensating for contradiction. Signal strength increases without additional effort. This alignment feels like calm certainty rather than excitement. It is marked by reduced internal dialogue and increased decisiveness. The mind no longer debates the outcome. It assumes it, and behavior follows naturally. Most people attempt to overpower resistance with enthusiasm. This fails because enthusiasm is temporary, while contradiction is continuous. The solution is not intensity, but consistency. A weak signal maintained steadily outperforms a strong signal, applied sporadically. When internal agreement is achieved even quietly, manifestation accelerates without strain. The universe responds swiftly to coherence, because coherence is readable. Self-recognition at this stage is often uncomfortable. One begins to see how often desire has been paired with disbelief, preparation for success with expectation of loss. This awareness is corrective, not punitive. Once seen, contradiction loses authority. Thought becomes cleaner, emotion settles. The system stabilizes. What was previously impossible begins to feel neutral, then probable, then inevitable. Internal coherence is not a moral achievement. It is a mechanical condition. When the system stops fighting itself, energy becomes available for construction rather than defense. Reality responds accordingly, not because it has changed its nature, but because the instruction has finally become singular. At this point, effort decreases and movement increases. The listener who reaches this understanding realizes that resistance was never external. It was internal signal conflict awaiting resolution. Manifestation fails when internal frequencies contradict each other. Imagination is commonly misunderstood because it has been misused. Most people treat it as escape, as indulgence, as a private theater detached from consequence. In truth, imagination is neither fantasy nor illusion. It is a tuning mechanism. It is the means by which the mind rehearses states before they become conditions. Every invention I have produced was completed in imagination before it was permitted to occupy matter. I did not guess and correct in the physical world. I aligned internally until the result was fixed, and only then did form comply. Imagination is not a dream. It is a laboratory. When an image is held with precision, the nervous system responds as though the event were real. Muscles prepare, emotions stabilize, and perception adjusts. This is not philosophy. It is physiology. The body does not distinguish sharply between external stimulus and internally generated experience when the imagery is coherent and sustained. In this way, imagination becomes the bridge between thought as signal and frequency as condition. A vague image produces a weak alignment. A precise image produces a locked state. The universe responds not to what you wish, but to what you repeatedly inhabit internally. Most failures at this stage occur because imagination is treated casually. People visualize briefly, inconsistently, and without sensory depth. They imagine results while simultaneously imagining obstacles. This splits the frequency. Effective imagination is not effortful, but it is exact. It does not require strain. It requires clarity. The more detailed the internal scene, the fewer variables remain unresolved. Sound, weight, temperature, movement, and consequence must be included. The mind locks more readily onto what feels complete than onto what feels speculative. Imagination must also be rehearsed without emotional excess. Emotion, when uncontrolled, destabilizes imagery. Excitement causes acceleration, and acceleration introduces distortion. Calm repetition stabilizes the signal. This is why imagination practiced quietly is more effective than visualization performed with urgency. The objective is not stimulation, but familiarity. When an internal scene becomes familiar, the subconscious accepts it as probable. When it is accepted as probable, resistance dissolves. When resistance dissolves, alignment becomes effortless. This process does not require long duration. It requires accuracy and continuity. A short period of precise imagination, repeated consistently, produces more alignment than extended sessions filled with distraction. The nervous system learns through repetition, not through intensity. Each rehearsal strengthens the same internal pathway until deviation becomes unlikely. At that point, imagination ceases to feel like imagination. It feels like memory, and memory carries authority. Imagination also trains expectation. What you repeatedly see internally becomes what you expect externally. Expectation shapes perception. Perception guides behavior. Behavior interacts with circumstance. Circumstance responds with feedback. This sequence is automatic once the initial condition is set. The mistake is attempting to skip this chain by forcing action. Action without internal alignment introduces friction. Action following imagination appears effortless because it is supported by expectation rather than resistance. It is important to understand that imagination does not create outcomes directly. It creates internal states that determine which outcomes are accessible. A man who imagines himself competent begins to notice instructions, opportunities, and corrections that were previously invisible. Another who imagines himself failing does the same, but in reverse. The universe does not discriminate. It reflects. Imagination selects the channel through which reflection occurs. The imagination must therefore be disciplined. Random imagery produces random results. Chosen imagery produces directed outcomes. This discipline is not repression, it is selection. One does not eliminate all images, but prioritizes one. When that image is returned to repeatedly, without contradiction, it becomes dominant. The system reorganizes around it. This is frequency locking. Once locked, deviation requires effort, and alignment becomes the path of least resistance. Many abandon imagination because results do not appear immediately. This reveals misunderstanding. Imagination establishes frequency. Time governs expression. The delay does not indicate failure. It indicates process. Seeds do not doubt soil because growth is unseen. The internal condition must mature until it can support external form. Those who persist calmly reach this threshold without struggle. Those who abandon early reset the system and begin again without realizing it. Imagination, when used correctly, produces quiet confidence rather than excitement. The outcome feels settled internally, long before it appears externally. This inner settlement is the signal of alignment. At this point, effort diminishes and patience increases naturally. The mind stops asking when. It assumes sequence. This assumption is not hope. It is recognition that the frequency has been set and no longer requires reinforcement. To imagine is not to pretend, it is to prepare. It is the act of bringing the internal system into agreement with a specific state so completely that contradiction becomes improbable. When imagination is treated with this seriousness, manifestation ceases to be mysterious. It becomes procedural. The listener who understands this no longer visualizes to escape reality, but to organize it. Imagination locks frequency when it is precise, calm, and repeated. Detachment is misunderstood because it is mistaken for indifference, when in fact it is the highest form of control. Most people cling to outcomes because they believe attachment accelerates arrival, yet attachment destabilizes frequency by introducing urgency. Urgency is a signal of absence. It announces that the internal state is incomplete, that the system is still negotiating with itself. The universe does not respond to negotiation. It responds to settled conditions. Detachment is not withdrawal of interest, but withdrawal of emotional volatility. It is the removal of noise from the signal so that instruction can be read without distortion. When a person watches an outcome too closely, he interferes with its formation. Observation charged with anxiety collapses probability into resistance. This is not metaphor. In any system, excessive monitoring introduces fluctuation. A stable process requires uninterrupted continuity. When attention oscillates between expectation and fear, the internal frequency wavers, and reality mirrors that wavering through delay. Detachment stabilizes because it removes the oscillation. The thought remains, the intention remains, but the emotional interference is silenced. What remains is clarity without pressure. Desperation is not intensity, it is collapse. It arises when trust in sequence has been replaced by urgency for result. This urgency introduces contradiction. The mind affirms attainment while the emotion confirms absence. The stronger signal is absence because it is continuous. The universe responds accordingly. Detachment resolves this contradiction by restoring internal agreement. One no longer needs proof to maintain alignment. The condition is assumed, not demanded. In this state, frequency stabilizes naturally, and the system resumes forward movement without effort. Calm expectation is not passivity, it is precision. A person who is calm about an outcome is not waiting, he is settled. His nervous system behaves as though the outcome is already accounted for. Decisions are made without haste, reactions are reduced, opportunities are recognized without excitement. This neutrality is often mistaken for lack of ambition by those who rely on emotional propulsion. In truth, it is the sign that internal alignment has been achieved and no longer requires reinforcement through feeling. Detachment also protects the signal from external interference. Opinions, delays, and contradictions from others lose their power when the internal state is stabilized. The mind no longer reacts to evidence prematurely. It understands that appearance lags behind cause. This understanding produces patience without doubt. Patience without doubt is rare, yet it is the most fertile condition for manifestation. The universe completes processes on its own schedule, governed by sequence rather than preference. Detachment respects this law and therefore works with it. Many believe that caring less will reduce results. The opposite is true. Caring without attachment produces clarity, while caring with attachment produces distortion. When a man releases the need to control timing and form, he stops interfering with the mechanism. The system completes itself. This is why outcomes often arrive when they are no longer chased. The frequency has stabilized, and the universe is free to respond without resistance from the observer. Detachment is achieved not by suppression, but by understanding. Once it is seen that frequency, once set, does not require constant emotional maintenance, the compulsion to check, worry, or adjust dissolves. Confidence replaces vigilance, silence replaces commentary. The mind rests in assumption rather than anticipation. This resting state is not sleep. It is readiness without tension. In this state, the internal system consumes less energy, maintaining itself, and becomes efficient. The listener may notice that detachment feels like relief. This relief is not abandonment of desire, but confirmation that desire has moved from effort to structure. When something is structurally certain, emotion relaxes. No one feels anxious about gravity continuing to function. In the same way, when frequency is stabilized, the outcome no longer requires emotional supervision. It proceeds as law dictates. This is the point at which manifestation stops feeling like pursuit and begins to feel like sequence. Detachment, therefore, is not a technique applied after failure. It is a condition that allows success to complete itself. Once emotional neutrality is achieved, frequency remains fixed, and reality has no alternative but to reorganize accordingly. The system moves forward quietly, without drama, without urgency, without announcement. This quietness is not emptiness. It is completion occurring beyond sensation. Detachment stabilizes frequency by removing emotional interference. Once frequency has been stabilized through coherence, imagination, and detachment, the question of time inevitably arises. People observe delay and assume error. Yet delay is not evidence of failure, but of law operating correctly. Every process unfolds according to sequence, and sequence cannot be bypassed without consequence. Energy moves instantly, but form requires arrangement. What is aligned internally may be complete in principle, yet incomplete in structure. The universe does not resist speed, it obeys order. When order is ignored, expectation becomes impatience, and impatience reintroduces instability into the system. Time is not an adversary, it is a function of translation. Frequency exists outside duration, but manifestation must pass through layers of organization before it appears tangible. Seeds do not sprout the moment they are planted, not because the soil doubts them, but because growth requires stages that cannot be compressed. To demand immediate visibility is to misunderstand causation. What has been said internally begins its journey outward through natural law, not preference. The delay you observe is the time required for rearrangement, not hesitation. Most people interfere at this stage by reintroducing effort. They question, adjust, reassert, and correct prematurely, unaware that each interruption destabilizes what was previously stable. The system is asked to reorganize while its parameters are being altered. This produces oscillation rather than progress. The universe responds accurately by slowing expression until clarity returns. This slowing is often misinterpreted as denial. In truth, it is protection against incoherence. Gestation is not inactivity. During apparent stillness, countless variables are aligning beyond perception. Probability reorganizes, paths converge, conditions synchronize. The absence of visible movement does not indicate absence of progress. Those who understand this cease to measure success by immediacy. They recognize that natural law cannot be hurried without distortion. Patience, when grounded in understanding, is not passive waiting. It is non-interference with an active process. Time delay serves another function. It tests stability. A frequency that cannot remain consistent across time cannot support durable outcomes. Quick manifestations that collapse are the result of premature expression without structural integrity. Enduring results require maturation. The universe allows what is stable to persist and what is unstable to dissolve. This filtration is not moral, it is mechanical. What lasts is what remains coherent long enough to integrate fully into form. Impatience often reveals lingering doubt. A mind that trusts sequence does not demand proof. It observes continuity. When doubt remains, the mind seeks reassurance through results. This seeking reintroduces emotional fluctuation, weakening the signal. Understanding the role of time eliminates this loop. Once sequence is accepted as law, the mind relaxes. The frequency remains undisturbed. The process completes itself without further instruction. There are no shortcuts because shortcuts violate order. Any attempt to bypass stages introduces imbalance that must later be corrected. What appears faster initially becomes slower eventually. Natural law conserves balance. Manifestation that respects sequence arrives quietly and endures. Manifestation that violates sequence arrives dramatically and dissipates. This is why sudden success without internal preparation often collapses. The frequency was not mature enough to sustain the form. Time is therefore not something to endure, but something to cooperate with. Cooperation requires understanding. Once understood, time ceases to provoke anxiety. It becomes a neutral dimension through which alignment passes. The individual no longer watches the clock, because watching implies doubt. He watches his own state instead, ensuring that frequency remains intact. This attention to cause renders concern for effect unnecessary. When alignment is complete and detachment is stable, time becomes irrelevant to confidence. The outcome is known internally long before it appears externally. This knowing is not belief. It is recognition of sequence already in motion. Just as a trained engineer knows the result of a calculation before it is printed, the aligned individual knows the outcome before it is visible. The delay no longer disturbs him because the mechanism has already resolved. Those who reach this understanding do not rush manifestation. They allow it. Allowing is not surrender. It is acknowledgement that once frequency is set, law will complete the sequence without further interference. This is the calm that precedes arrival, not because arrival is imminent, but because arrival is inevitable under natural law. Time delay is the necessary sequence between frequency and former. Once alignment has been achieved internally, behavior changes without instruction. This change is often misunderstood because people assume action produces results, when in truth, action confirms a state already established. Behavior is not the cause of manifestation. It is its evidence. When frequency is coherent, movement follows naturally, not through effort but through inevitability. The body begins to act in accordance with the internal condition, just as a properly tuned machine operates without resistance. Action becomes a continuation of alignment, rather than an attempt to compensate for its absence. Most people act prematurely. They move before coherence is established, hoping behavior will generate certainty. This reverses order. Action taken from misalignment introduces friction, fatigue, and correction. Action taken from alignment feels light, precise, and self-evident. It does not require justification or force. The difference is immediately perceptible to the one acting. One feels pushed, the other feels guided. The universe responds to the latter because it reflects internal agreement rather than internal struggle. Inspired movement is not dramatic. It is quiet and specific. It arises without internal debate and proceeds without emotional charge. When the internal state is settled, decisions no longer feel risky. They feel obvious. This is not intuition in the mystical sense, but perception sharpened by coherence. Information that was previously ignored becomes visible. Timing improves. Choices narrow themselves naturally. The individual does not search for the correct action. He recognizes it as it appears. Effortless action does not mean inactivity. It means absence of resistance. The muscles move, the words are spoken, the commitments are made, yet there is no internal argument accompanying them. This absence of argument conserves energy and sharpens execution. Results accumulate not because more is done, but because less is wasted. Behavior becomes efficient because it is no longer compensating for doubt or contradiction. It follows alignment, the way current follows a completed circuit. Forcing action reveals insecurity. When a person must push himself constantly, he is signaling that the internal state is unresolved. This does not make action wrong, but it makes it noisy. Noise produces mixed results. Some progress may occur, but it lacks durability. When alignment precedes action, progress compounds. Each step confirms the next. Momentum builds without acceleration. The system moves forward because nothing within it is resisting direction. It is important to understand that behavior does not create frequency retroactively. Repetition of action without internal agreement trains exhaustion, not manifestation. This is why many industrious people remain stationary in outcome. Their actions are disconnected from their internal state. They work against themselves unknowingly. Once alignment is restored, behavior reorganizes spontaneously. What once required discipline becomes preference. What once required motivation becomes default. The universe does not reward effort. It responds to coherence expressed through movement. When behavior reflects internal alignment, external systems respond smoothly. Obstacles diminish not because they disappear, but because they are approached correctly. Timing adjusts, cooperation appears, resistance fades. This is often mistaken for luck. In reality, it is resonance between internal condition and external circumstance. At this stage, the individual no longer asks what to do next. He observes what he is drawn to do. That draw is not impulse. It is alignment expressing itself through motion. When followed, it leads to outcomes that feel unsurprising in retrospect. The path appears logical only after it has been walked, because it was chosen at the level of frequency rather than deliberation. This is the difference between planning and alignment. Behavior, then, is not a lever but a mirror. It reflects the internal state faithfully. When the state is stable, behavior becomes trustworthy. When the state is unstable, behavior becomes erratic. To correct behavior without correcting state is futile. To correct state is to allow behavior to correct itself. The listener who understands this stops forcing action and begins observing alignment. Action resumes naturally, and results follow as confirmation, not as reward. Action confirms alignment, but never creates it. When frequency is fully set, nothing remains to be done. This statement is often misunderstood as finality, yet it refers not to cessation of life, but to cessation of struggle. Once the internal condition is coherent, imagination precise, resistance dissolved, emotion neutral, sequence respected, and behavior aligned, the system enters a state of inevitability. At this point, outcomes are no longer pursued. They unfold. The individual does not wait anxiously, because waiting implies uncertainty. He lives within the assumption that resolution is already contained within the present state, requiring only time to translate into form. Inevitability does not announce itself with excitement. It arrives as stillness. The mind ceases to ask questions about outcome and turns its attention back to maintenance of condition. This maintenance is effortless because the state has become natural. There is no reinforcement through emotion, no repetition driven by fear. The frequency holds itself. When a system reaches this point, interference becomes unnecessary and even undesirable. The universe responds with equal restraint, arranging circumstances quietly, without spectacle according to law. Living as though the outcome is resolved internally does not mean pretending. It means behaving in accordance with a condition already accepted as fact. Speech changes, posture changes, decisions change, not because one is attempting to influence reality, but because the internal model has stabilized. These changes are subtle, yet unmistakable. They do not seek validation. They do not accelerate to prove themselves. They proceed calmly, as gravity proceeds, without apology. Certainty at this stage is not belief. Belief requires maintenance. Certainty is recognition. It is the understanding that once frequency is fixed, expression cannot fail, only arrive in sequence. This understanding produces a quiet confidence that is often misinterpreted as detachment from ambition. In truth, ambition has been absorbed into structure. Desire no longer agitates the system. It has been converted into expectation, and expectation into assumption. The individual who has reached inevitability no longer interprets delay as threat. Delay is simply space through which alignment travels. There is no impulse to adjust, no compulsion to reaffirm. The system is trusted because it has been engineered correctly. This trust is not emotional, it is mechanical. Just as an engineer trusts a completed circuit to function when energized, the aligned individual trusts the process to complete without supervision. At this stage, manifestation ceases to feel personal. Outcomes are received without intoxication, because they were anticipated internally long before arrival. Gratitude replaces excitement. Use replaces attachment. The individual does not cling to results, because he understands they are effects, not sources. He maintains frequency, not form. This maintenance ensures continuity of creation without exhaustion. Life becomes a sequence of confirmations rather than a series of pursuits. Inevitability also dissolves fear. Fear arises from uncertainty. When uncertainty is removed, fear loses its function. The future no longer appears as a threat or a hope, but as a continuation of a state already in motion. This perception brings calm even in complexity. Problems are approached without panic. Losses are interpreted without collapse. Successes are integrated without distortion. The internal condition remains primary, and everything else reorganizes around it. This is not the end of desire. It is the end of desperation. Desire becomes directive rather than consuming. It selects frequencies rather than chasing effects. The individual understands that creation is ongoing and that states can be reset deliberately. Manifestation becomes repeatable because the mechanism is understood. There is no mystery left to defend, only law to apply. The universe becomes cooperative not because it has changed but because the instruction has become unmistakable. When frequency is set completely, reality has no alternative but to comply. This compliance is not dramatic, it is exact. It occurs without permission and without exception. The individual no longer measures progress by visible signs because the internal resolution is sufficient. Life feels complete even as it continues to unfold. This completion is the mark of mastery, not because nothing remains to be created, but because creation is no longer questioned. Once frequency is set, outcome is inevitable.